We are in Discipleship 101. We're talking about Bible doctrines as of the last couple of weeks. And tonight we're going to go to the doctrine of the creation. And this is a topic that you definitely, there's no way we would go into in great depth in one study in one Wednesday night, but it is a very important doctrine, and we're going to focus in on one aspect of it that's probably foundational, I would say, for the Christian in his or her understanding in the faith. So go ahead, Ethan, and give me the next one if you don't mind, sir, and hope and pray it works. Okay, here we go. Let's read this. I'll read it to you. We believe, and when I say we believe, I'm speaking from our church, and most of the things our church has got written down, I wrote it, or somebody did, and I adapted it. And so this is what I believe, and this is what I teach to our church, and collectively as a church, this is our belief. We believe in the literal historicity of the Genesis account of God's creating this earth and man in 7 literal 24-hour days. We'll talk about that in a moment. Of man's early home in the garden paradise, of his fall by eating the forbidden fruit, of his spiritual death and depraved nature resulting from this rebellion, and of his expulsion from the garden. Now, that's a big, long doctrinal statement. We're really going to focus in on one part of it, but I believe I snagged that from our doctrinal statements. I believe that's where I got it from originally when I did this. Go ahead to the next one, Mr. Ethan. Second part of this. We totally reject, again, I say we collectively, I'm talking about me and our church's stance. We totally reject evolution as being merely an alternate theory of origins. It dictates one's total worldview. Now, I'm going to pause for a second, and I'll probably do this a few times, so just pardon me and bear with me for a moment. To believe evolution as it is taught in our day would dictate one's worldview. What do I mean by that? Well, the idea there is if I accept evolution, and we'll talk about where that all comes from in a moment, but if I accept evolution, then that's putting one pair of glasses on that I'm going to see this world and life through. If I reject evolution and embrace creationism, which is what I believe Genesis 1 teaches, we're going to see in a moment, then I'm putting a different set of glasses on to see the world, to see life, and to see everything in it through. You're going to have one of those two pairs of glasses on. Most likely, there are some other instances where people have maybe some other belief, but primarily most people, at least in America, would be wearing one of those two sets of glasses. And so one of those two is what you see this world through. Okay, so it dictates one's total worldview, including his foundation for truth and morals. Evolution is the creation of the depraved mind of fallen man in his vain attempt to avoid God. If God did not create, then he has no right to control. So there's a lot involved in a person's, if you would use this term, a person's worldview. What glasses am I looking through to interpret, to understand, to see everything in this world? There's a lot involved in that. And so go ahead, Ethan. Evolution turns this universe into a giant machine operated by the laws of nature, ruling God out and denying the supernatural origin of the Bible and all biblical miracles. Evolution ultimately deifies man, deifies man and makes God irrelevant and unnecessary. Evolution and biblical Christianity are incompatible. So let me talk about that for a second. They're not compatible, and I know we're going somewhere. I know that there is a thing called theistic evolution. We're going to get there in a moment. They're incompatible, really, because if we understand what Genesis chapters 1 and 2 say, and we understand what God is telling us there, then if we decide that that's not true, then we have to decide that it's false, right? If something's not true, it's false. So if I decide what Genesis 1 and 2 says is not true, then I'm saying it's false. And in doing that, then I have to decide what is the origin of all things from there. And we'll come back to that in a moment. All right. The doctrine of creation. Let's look at Genesis 1:1, and we'll start there. Genesis 1:1, probably the most important verse in the Bible, even though it doesn't teach salvation or any of those things. It's not got the gospel in it, really. But in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The atmosphere, the sky, the things above, and the earth, the things that we stand on and below. In the beginning, the Bible says that God created those things. Go ahead, Mr. Ethan. That tells us a couple things. What you believe about Genesis 1:1 will ultimately determine what you believe about life, death, God, and the Bible. So the reason I say that is, if I determine that, okay, yes, in the beginning, that means when it started, God, who was already there, created everything as we know it, then that makes me a person who is a believer in God, and I believe He is the one that made it. He is the one that created. He's the one that sustains it, and thus He's the one that ultimately we're accountable to if I believe Genesis 1:1. Thus, you discover the importance of what we believe about creation. And so, go ahead, Mr. Ethan. So what does verse 1 teach us? There's actually, I would break it into three parts. First, we see the origin of time in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. He is intending, I believe, to tell us that this is where time started. You know, if you've got kids, I know, and some of y'all are young enough to have been a kid when this came out, but if you've got kids, you have seen the cartoon, The Land Before Time, right? And you saw as it comes on, and I don't remember exactly what the numbers are, but as it comes on, it says like so many 100 million years ago or something, and then you see the dinosaurs and all those things took place that are portrayed in that cartoon. And that is common across the board. It's universal. Any American, at least, cartoon or movie that addresses any subject as it relates to dinosaurs and things of that nature, it always says so many million years ago, such and such happened. But what we're told in Genesis 1, in verse 1, is that time began at a very specific point, and it tells us that God is the one who is the origin of time. He kicked the clock off, if you would. He started it. He started time. The second thing we learn there is the existence of an eternal, all-powerful God. And the reason that we describe him that way in this verse, as we look at this verse, is because it just says, in the beginning, God. It's very interesting that God did not take any time to explain his existence. He didn't take any time to really even explain himself. He just said, when it all started, I did it. That's all he tells us. In the beginning, when it all started, when it all began, I'm the one that started it. And that's what God tells us in Genesis 1:1. And so we see the existence of an eternal and all-powerful God who was there, eternal, the idea. He was there before time began, hence, or he would not be able to be the one who started time. And then the third point from Genesis 1:1 is we see the formation of all that exists. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so from that one statement, we can deduct all of those truths, where time started, who started it, and where everything that exists came from. Does that make sense so far? Okay, go to the next one, Mr. Ethan. So verse 2 now helps us understand the progression of what we're going to be following as we read throughout the rest of chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Genesis. So let's read verse 2 now. I believe that's the next slide for you, Ethan. Verse 2 says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." That's verse 2. Go ahead, Ethan. The immediate reading of this verse will let the reader know that the earth is now created, but it is not formed into the place and systems that we know it to be today. So let's pause here for a second and talk about that, because there are many teachings, even in the Christian world, that find their foundation in verse number 2 of Genesis chapter 1. They say all kind of things from this verse. It says he created it. He started time. God did. And then he created heavens and the earth. And then from there, we're going to go on and get a description of what it is he created. And he says it was without form and void. And go ahead, Ethan, to the next one. Some people defined without form and void in this way. They say ruined or desolate. We'll come back to that in a moment. Here's what the words actually are. It means to be unformed, and it means to be uninhabited. That's the idea that's presented. A lot of people read into verse 2, and you may or may not have heard this, and I don't want to encourage you to go chasing after it because you'll get to reading all kind of stuff, crazy stuff. But there are a lot of groups that believe that what's being described here is a creation and a civilization that existed before the civilization that we're about to read about in the rest of Genesis 1 and 2. They believe that there was already another creation, another civilization of man, and all the things that happened, and they were all destroyed, and then God's going to come back and do something different later. And there's a couple of reasons why we know for certain that that's not true, okay? So how do I know that there wasn't a civilization before what's about to be described? A couple of things. Number one would be because there is nothing stated about that whatsoever in the Bible. Somebody read that into these words in verse 2. Does not say that at all. Number two, when God creates in the following verses, the trees, the plants, the animals, and all the things, the sun, the light, the waters, all of those things are separated. When God does all of that, he creates man in a perfect condition. And at that point in time, man is perfect, and there is no sin in the world. And so there is no death in the world. So if there is no death in the world, then how could there have been a whole civilization that died? So the first death, at least is recorded in Scripture, of a human is when Cain kills his brother. The first death recorded in Scripture of anything was when God slew animals to make a coat of covering for Adam and Eve after they sinned. And so this interpretation of verse 2 to describe something that was before and now it's ruined and God's starting over, I believe is very wanting in any evidence in Scripture that that's what it's talking about. That's somebody read that into that verse. Do not believe it said at all. But what is stated here, and this is interesting, go to the next one, Mr. Ethan, if you don't mind. Here's what I believe is stated. And I'm quoting Adam Clark here. That's an old timer from many, 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 many years ago. But here's what he says. God seems at first to have created the elementary principles of all things. And this formed the grand mass of matter, which in this state must be without arrangement or any distinction of parts, a vast collection of indescribably confused materials of nameless entities strangely mixed. Now, what in the world does that mean? Let me tell you what Adam Clark is saying. I think he's probably correct. But ultimately what he's saying is the reason he uses the words without form and void to describe what God created is because God made everything that he was going to use to do what we're about to read about in the rest of Genesis chapter 1 and 2 in that first creative act. All of the elements, all the materials, all of the words he uses, the distinction of parts, vast collection of indescribably confused materials, all the things that God's going to use to create everything else he makes, he created at that moment in time when it says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what Adam Clark's describing. And I haven't done a great detail of research about that, and I'm not going to act like I have. But I tend to agree with what he's saying. I believe that's what's being described. It's definitely not a former civilization. I don't buy that at all. That's ridiculous. So what's being described here, though, is probably the rough elements that God is going to use to do what he's about to do in his creative act. Now, let's stop for a second and talk about when is this happening, okay? When is this happening? Because there's another teaching that comes along here. Not in that there's another civilization, but there's another teaching that occurs here sometimes, especially in verse 2, where people believe now that there is God did this, he created this, and he uses some very interesting words, this vast collection of indescribably confused materials of nameless entities strangely mixed, Adam Clark's way with words for sure. There's this belief in some embrace that God created these things, and then he stopped his creative work, and he waited for a time before he gets into what's stated next. I'll tell you why I don't believe that's the case in a moment, but he waited a time. And so now some call that a gap theory, and there's different ideas about it, but that God created the earth in its rough form, and he just left it. And he went away and he went to play golf. God don't play golf, we know that. But he went away to do something else, or he just kind of paused in his creative acts and decided to wait for a while. I'm sorry. Oh, okay, now I don't think it was that either. But anyway. But God stopped his creative act, and there was a long span of time between point A and then point B, which begins in the rest of Genesis 1 and goes into chapter 2. That there's this long span of time, gap theory, some call it. And so this is the first of the gaps. And they would say, and I will talk about why in a moment, I think that they even came up with this idea, they would say, those who taught this many, many, many years ago, would say that this is where your millions of years probably come into play. So that's where your millions of years took place. Now, here's a problem. There are no animals, because they throw the dinosaurs in there and stuff, There are no animals yet. There's not anything living that we know of on this thing that God created. He just made it in its rough form. He's going to do something wonderful with it in the next little while as we read on. But this is just the very beginning, the things that he took to begin with that he made to form the rest. Now, go to the next one, Mr. Ethan. Why would people believe and why would people want to read into verse 2 that there is this gap of time and maybe even this former civilization or whatever? Why would they do that? Well, number one, I believe, and these are my thoughts, whether they're right or wrong, and this is definitely etymological, I believe they perceive the numbers. Let the sheriff come by. All right. I believe they perceive the numbers that come from the evolutionists to be scientifically proven and correct. Let's talk about this for a second. Why would a person who believes the Bible why would you see that here? I guess is what I'm saying. Why would I see millions of years here? Why would I see a big gap here? Well, I think first and foremost, and this all arose at about the same time frame in church history, I believe that it's because at that time, it was expected that when the evolutionists began to talk about the earth being millions and millions and millions and millions of years old, that there had to be some scientific proof to that, and so they just kind of accepted and embraced it, right? They just assumed, okay, that has to be true, and if that has to be true, we got to find some years somewhere here in the Bible because we don't want to sound dumb and we don't want to be wrong, and I know the Bible is right, so we got to have, and they found a gap here, and that's probably where some of it came from. And then number two, because of academic pressure that presents this thinking as the more academic or intelligent idea. And so, in other words, they didn't want to seem dumb. Because we know if the scientist says something, they're right? They had to be right? Well, many times they are right when they're dealing with science. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Go ahead to the next one, Mr. Ethan. I want y'all to watch this video real quick. Go ahead, Ethan, play it. Make sure it's loud enough for us, too, when you start. And it's not playing. Just click again on your right arrow. There you go.
Have you ever heard this? Billions of years ago, there was an explosion in space. Or 100,000 years ago, this happened or that happened. Or even, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Question, how does anyone know? I mean, was anybody there to observe it? Well, actually somebody was, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Check this out. First of all, we need to recognize that there is a huge difference between observational science and historical science. Both are valuable, but very different. Let's define the two real quick, shall we? Observational science is simply when we observe something and experiment to draw conclusions. It involves repeatable experimentation and observations in the present. It's through observational science that we find cures for diseases and build space shuttles, stuff like that. Now, through historical science, we consider things that happened in the past, but they cannot be checked in the same way. I mean, we don't have access to the past like we do the present because, well, it's gone, right? All we really have is speculation, or at best, circumstantial evidences of past events based on what we see in the present. That's not to say that we can't make intelligent guesses about the past, or form reasonable inferences from rocks or fossils in the present, but we certainly cannot directly test our conclusions because we cannot repeat the past. Got it? So, does that mean historical science is unimportant? Not at all. Let's drop an example down here for a minute and take a look at the Eiffel Tower. You know, that 19th century Parisian monument designed by Gustave Eiffel that stands 1,063 feet tall, which was built as the entrance for the 1889 World's Fair and is still the tallest building in Paris today, visited by millions of people each year? Yeah, that one. Well, guess what? Everything I just told you is true, but how do we test it? Well, applying observational science, we can, of course, observe the Eiffel Tower anytime we're in Paris. It's here in the present. Then, we can continue by testing the height and comparing it to all the other structures in Paris and confirm the claim that it is indeed the tallest building in Paris. But that's the extent of the kind of facts that can be proved by observational science in reference to this claim. How do we really know that Gustave designed it? How do we really know it was built in the 19th century as an entrance to the 1889 World's Fair? How do we really know how many people visited? That's all in the past. It can't be repeated. For that kind of information, we need to go outside the limits of observational science and discover what has been communicated to us through historical documents and eyewitness accounts. And furthermore, we have to believe those eyewitnesses and documents are trustworthy. The same is true when we talk about the origin of the earth. The earth is here. We all agree with that. So, does observational science confirm that the world was created by God, and are there trustworthy documents and eyewitness accounts that confirm it? Well, let's take the last part first. In short, what we're really asking is my original question: was anybody there to observe it? The answer is yes. God was there, and He told us how He created. He inspired people to write down His very words that became books that were compiled into a complete book called the Bible, which has been verified over and over again and has demonstrated itself to be totally trustworthy in all it claims and teaches. Even secular scholars will concede that the Bible accurately records historical events. Anyway, we have the most trustworthy revelation from the most trustworthy eyewitness. Now, what about observational science? Does it confirm the Bible? Yes. And what's extremely important to realize is the observable fact that the universe is logical and orderly. That makes sense only if its creator is logical and has imposed order on his creation. It doesn't make sense at all if the universe is just an accident of a huge explosion. Also, our minds are able to comprehend many things about the universe, and that's only possible if the creator of the mind gave us the ability and desire to explore the universe. It doesn't make sense if our brains are byproducts of chance because we couldn't trust their conclusions to ever be accurate. And lastly, it only makes sense that we can observe and repeat an experiment if the universe consistently obeys the same laws from day to day, which only makes sense if a lawgiver created it that way and upholds it. So to be bluntly honest, science itself, whether observational or historical, is only possible because God exists and the Bible is true. I could go on, but enough said.
Just to kind of get us thinking for a moment, he talks about observational science and historical science. Let me talk about those two for a moment. You probably already got this from the video, but in case you didn't, observational science is what's done in labs, and some of our folks even work at places like that where they study things. Observational science says I can look at something, I can investigate it, I can get it to happen again, reproduce it, and thus through that process I can conclude scientifically that X plus Y equals whatever, right? I can conclude that from studying it, observing it, and repeating the processes is necessary for something to happen. And that's very helpful to us. Our medicines, he mentioned, are the byproduct of that. Many of the things that we benefit from, if you get sick and you go to the doctor and the things they do, byproduct of that. People have studied, they've researched, they've looked at, they figured out things, and thank God that He's given us a mind that's able to think through those things and do those things. So in stating that, observational science is a wonderful thing, and it helps us in many, many, many ways. Now, there are some things that we're paying for in our government for scientific studies that I don't know if I agree with, like whether a snail, where the snail goes or whatever. I don't know but anyway, that's a whole other subject for another day. But observational science is a wonderful thing. However, when we begin to talk about things that happened in the past, that is no longer observational science. That becomes historical science. And there is a vast difference because things, as he said in the video, from history cannot be reproduced, right? And we weren't there, so thus we don't know for certain what happened unless someone tells us. And so because that's true, I told you in the very beginning of our study tonight, what a person concludes about Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that gives them a pair of glasses to look at everything through. And so a person who embraces Genesis 1:1 and says, yes, God is the creator of all things, and I believe that, a person who has that pair of glasses on is going to see everything in that way. On the other hand, a person who rejects the idea of God and says, I don't believe that there is a God, and I believe that, the best thing they've come up with is the Big Bang Theory and evolution. I believe in the Big Bang Theory and evolution. That's another pair of glasses. And so with that pair of glasses, they're going to interpret everything they see through that pair of glasses. Now, I say all of that to get to this point. I want us for just a second to try to understand why. You remember I said the reason those guys would try to find that gap and try to find those things when they were reading the Bible is because they didn't want to sound dumb, and they assumed the scientists say this, so it has to be right. I want to explain why scientists, and I don't even want to use the word scientists because there are many Christian scientists in our world today who believe in God and have rejected entirely these other ideas. But why would a secular scientist see things so differently? Are we ignorant, stupid, and wrong? Or Is there another answer to that? And I believe there is another answer. And the answer lies in that pair of glasses that I just described to you, okay? So here's my illustration for this. So follow me for a moment. Behind our house, there is a creek called Laurel Creek that runs at the back, kind of almost to the back of our property. And most of the time, it has very little water in it. Miss Bobby Jean probably played in it when she was a little girl many, many years ago. It's got very little water in it most of the time. And it's probably, and I'm completely guessing, all the numbers I'm about to throw out are made up. I did not go measure anything, just so you know. But I'm guessing it to be 8 to 10 feet deep in most places as far as the ditch itself. Not water 8 foot, but just the ditch itself. And so if we wanted to do a scientific study of Laurel Creek behind Tim McCright's house, we could go out there, we could take some measurements, and we could study that creek for a year, let's say. And we studied it for a year, and we concluded after all the rains that came that year and all the things that happened, whatever takes place out there, kids playing in the creek, whatever, at the end of the year, it got 2 inches deeper, okay? And again, I'm making all this up. It got 2 inches deeper. Then we could conclude that every year we get 2 inches more depth in this creek. So if we said 8 feet times inches and so on and so forth, we could figure out this creek's been here for this many years, right? And that would seem to be at least a very valid conclusion to come to. However, and this is where the glasses begin to change. If you need to be mindful of this. If that conclusion is only correct if all of the other variables that are involved in Laurel Creek are the same. For instance, let's say that there was a 10-year span where it rained cats and dogs multiple times, and I mean, it was just, if we normally, and again, I'm making up numbers, I should have looked them up, I don't know. If we normally get 10 foot of water in a year, and we got 30 feet of water for those years, 10 years in a row. Well, that's going to change your numbers some, right? Because we don't have a consistent same amount of water that flows through every year. And then let's say this, okay? Let's say that when Bobby Jean was a baby, her family went out there 25 years ago. Her family went out there and logged that land. And let's say they drug the logs with mules, because there weren't any tree cutting machines back then. It would have been mules. And they drug all the logs with mules, and they drug every one of them down the path of Laurel Creek and drug it out that way. That was the way they went with every one of them. I know we're making this up, so just bear with me. And let's say that after they got done doing that, they had a 4-foot trench already in a week's time, okay? And obviously you see where I'm going. Our observation of what we saw in that creek has been tainted in a major way. Number one, there were some weeks where years where rain was way more than normal. And number two, they forgot about Miss Bobby Jean riding on the back of the mule going down through there pulling the logs. They didn't even consider that. It didn't start out at ground zero. It started out 4 foot deep, right? And so if that were true, and again, this is all made up, but if that were true, that would completely sway the conclusion. It would really make the conclusion I came to after doing my research for a year, it would make it all wrong. As a matter of fact, I was so far off, I'm way off, right? Because we started 4 foot deep on day one. And so when we're talking about secular scientists who are doing research and investigating things through the lens, through their worldview that says that everything evolved and so on and so forth, when they're looking at things that way, they're going to interpret it very differently than if they had a different set of glasses on. That's why if we went out in the western part of our country and one of those places where they found dinosaur bones and things of that nature, and you took the guy with the secular glasses on, and you took a guy with the creation glasses on, and you put them both beside the same dinosaur bone, as they look at it and research it, they're going to come to two very different conclusions, probably across the board, other than there's a dinosaur bone. That's probably going to be the one thing they agree upon, that there's a dinosaur bone here. And the reason for that is they're going to see things differently. And so when you begin to read after a secular scientist, a secular thinker, whoever it is, with that pair of glasses on, they are interpreting everything differently than a person who would have creation glasses on and be looking at things through the lens of creation. Because that's true, we're going to come to very different ideas. For instance, when they go and look at rocks in the Grand Canyon, or they go and dig out here and figure out the layers of rocks out here and dirt and everything out here, the different layers. If we assume that all of that had to build up over time consistently, like Laurel Creek, you remember it was running out 2 inches a year, I think is what I said, then you could come to some conclusions about that. However, if there was like a time where men did that which was right in their own eyes, and God said to Noah, I'm going to flood the world, build an ark, and if that happened, then that's going to just completely destroy all of your observations that you would have made with the secular scientist lens, because that throws that's the log coming down Laurel Creek, making a 4-foot trench on day one, where you were thinking, no, we started out ground zero on day one. And that's an oversimplified example, but the point I'm making is, depending on what glasses you wear, you're going to interpret what you see very differently. And so that's how we can say to one person who we say this is a scientist and he's got his secular glasses on, that's how he looks at something and says, this thing's got to be 400 million years old. And then we go over here to a scientist that is a creationist scientist with that set of glasses on, and he says, actually, I think this is about 4,000 years old. That's how they can be so different, because they're starting at two different points, and they're observing from two different sets of glasses and looking at it in two different ways. The creationist has a few things in his mind. Number one, he believes everything was made just like that. And he knows that there was a flood, which changed everything. The whole world was submerged in water. No question. If you believe the Bible, there's no question that that's true. And so the creationist is going to interpret everything differently than this other guy, because this guy don't think any of that's true. He didn't believe any of that's true. He believes everything started with a bang, and then somehow or another we ended up here, and it's just like this long, drawn-out progression until finally it got to some living cell, a single cell, which doesn't anyway, to a single cell, and then it became something else, and it mutated into something else, and then sooner or later you get a monkey, and then it becomes a man, right? That is an overly simplistic description of what an evolutionist assumes to be the case, because that's what he believes. And that's fine. That's what he believes. But he is going to interpret everything based upon what he believes, as a creationist would as well. And that's why we get such a vast difference in interpretations of things that are looked at and studied. Is because they're looking from two different sets of eyes in two different ways with two different pair of glasses on, if you would. And so, back to Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. If I embrace that as a Christian, and by the way, as a Christian, if I don't believe that, I need to be praying about that, because I need to come to the place where I understand, because this is like foundational. God made this. God made this. It didn't happen by accident, and it couldn't have happened by accident. God made this. It is organized. It is ruled by laws that are set in place. There's no question there was a very intelligent designer of everything that's been designed. I have to come to that place as a Christian, I believe. But then, once I understand that, the earth was without form and void, and darkness covered the face thereof, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Then I can go to verse 2, and I can begin to understand this is God just beginning this process. The Spirit of God, which, by the way, Jesus later, John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was in the beginning with God, and all things were made by him. So Jesus is accredited to being the one who created everything. Here, the Spirit of God is mentioned at the creation. And of course, God the Father is present at the creation, because that's who we're talking about here. And so we discover that God, a triune God, whom we try our best to understand who he is and understand what that even means, but a triune God created everything. And when I understand, when I come to the place where I can embrace the reality that he created it, then I can definitely embrace the reality that he created it instantaneously. And then he rolled right into, to use Dwayne's term, he rolled right into verse 3, let there be light, and there was light. Immediately, God began to do what's recorded for us in chapter 1 and then repeated for us partially in chapter 2, And that is, he went into what we know as the 6 days of creation. Day 1, I believe, includes verse 1 and 2 of Genesis chapter 1. God made it all the stuff he was going to use, and then he begins this process of separating the waters from the land, the air from the water, putting plant life on the land, making the lights like they would be, putting water life and then animal life and then human life on that which he created. And all of that is built upon his creative act in verse number 1. And so that's what I've concluded. And when I say we believe that, that's the stance of our church. That's what God did in the beginning. And I have no problem whatsoever believing that. And yes, I do know that for many, they would look at a person like me that believes that and think I was inept or something's wrong with you, right? But I fully believe it completely. And honestly, I don't even have a problem when they say that if you go, we went to museums in Washington, D.C., I think it was this last summer, and we went through some of the museums up there, Smithsonian and different ones, and all of these plaques that say how many millions and hundreds of millions of years old everything is. It don't even bother me because I already know that's wrong. I know it's wrong. I'm in question. And that's not because I think I'm smarter than them. I just think they ain't got the right glasses on so they can truly have a proper interpretation of what they're seeing. So real quick, in 5 minutes, I won't even ask. I'm just going to go ask a question somebody's going to ask. Where did dinosaurs come? Where were they? Like, what happened with dinosaurs? Because the land before time said it was like before time, right? So what happened with dinosaurs 400 billion, million, whatever years ago? The answer to that is when God created the land, air, and water, animals and mammals, he created dinosaurs. They lived on the earth during this time of creation because that's the only time things were created. I don't want to be overly simplistic, but the only time things were created was described right here in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. So the dinosaurs were created in Genesis 1 and 2. You say, well, how come we don't see Tyrannosaurus Rexes running around? Well, I'm glad we don't, personally. There's enough crazy people out there driving, what's less, anyway. But why don't we? Well, it's because they're not here anymore. They died. Probably most of them died in the flood because the flood submerged the whole world. Now, were there dinosaurs that didn't have to walk on land? Yes. There were some that were flying. They couldn't fly for a year, right? But there were some that were flying. There were a bunch of things in the water. And I believe most of those things, maybe not all, we don't know because there's parts of the water we haven't been to yet. But probably most of those things have become extinct for whatever reason. After the flood, we noticed something with humans, which is what we have recorded in the Bible, and that is there was something that immediately began to happen. What was that after the flood? Shorter lifespan. Like Methuselah, which was the picture of God's grace and his long suffering, lived to be how old? 969 years old, almost 1,000 years old. Boy, I know, I'm 47, and I'm already having aches and pains. I can imagine, what, and some of y'all are in your 70s, maybe even 80s, and like, man, so 1,000? But he did. He lived to be 969 years old. But then immediately after the flood, we began to see it decrease more and more and more until finally it gets to like the 100 range and kind of where we are today, 80s, 70s, 100. And the reason for that change, most believe, is because the atmosphere of the earth changed significantly after the flood. When the waters came upon the earth, I know in Sunday school we had a picture of the rains came down, the floods came up, and it did rain. But most of the water that flooded the earth didn't come from the sky as rain. Some of it did. But a lot of it came from inside the earth, which explains the breaking of the plates and the continents and all that kind of stuff to a degree. But the atmosphere of the earth changed significantly, probably a layer, maybe even of water around it originally. It now is gone, and so now we're getting direct sunlight and all of those things, and it changes everything. And so men live shorter lifespans than they did before. Animals as well are going to live shorter lifespans. I mean, just think, if Methuselah lived to be 969, think about animals before the flood. Like Like some of the animals that just get really big now. Think if they lived like hundreds of years. Just think about that. And so that all changed after the flood. There was a drastic change in lifespans because there was a drastic change in conditions on the earth. And so as a result of that, that's where your dinosaurs went. Most of them drowned. The ones that didn't drown probably died as a result of the changes that took place on the earth afterwards. And there probably still, I'm not going to say probably, there may be still some flesh swimming around in the ocean when y'all go down to the beach and get out there in the water and wade around. Just know. Could be something out there. Just want you to know. How many of y'all, when y'all get in the swimming pool, you still think of Jaws? Like you're thinking he's yeah, I know. I do. Anyway, that was the question I wanted to answer before anybody asked it. Is there any other question that comes to your mind about this that we could possibly try to deal with in a couple minutes?